All right, team. We are back in the Fireside PM pod, and I have Rory Braatvedt with me, who is an expert at demand generation. And we did a show a couple weeks ago with Raquel, and we were talking about all kinds of ways that people could do marketing these days. And then she and I talked about, oh, what would be a future show? And I said, well, if you want to do another one, a really interesting one would be for a entrepreneurial PM who has an MVP that's starting to get some traction and it's gotten a decent amount of founder-led sales, but now you want to really add more to the top of the funnel beyond what the founder's like personal network can do. What should they do? And she said, oh, I know just a person for you to have on. And I said, all right, let's get him on there. So welcome to the show, Rory.
Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, and full credit to you for pronouncing my last name correctly because I can barely do it myself. As you can gather, I'm not from your side of the world based on my accent and name. So I did live in Canada actually for 5 years, which is where I met Raquel, who you mentioned. But I'm from New Zealand and I live in New Zealand. So it's currently the next day for me in the morning and everything. We've got flying cars and stuff over here in the future. It's a different world. But yeah, so I mean, I was joking with you before, Tom. I thought that that I went way back with Raquel, but you go way back with Raquel. So, but yeah, no, super excited to talk to you today. And yeah, absolutely something that I've worked a lot around in is early stage startups, early stage companies who are looking to set up and scale their demand generation on a limited budget. It's a sort of pre-fundraising or on the road to seeking fundraising.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's an interesting world to be playing in because it's moving quickly and it's tough. It's hard. So yeah, excited to chat to you about it today.
Love it. But so before we get into that, maybe a little bit of background about yourself. I'm super jealous of you being able to work from New Zealand. I've been on my list of places to visit forever, and I remember also following you. You all had a really kind of fresh, energetic prime minister. I don't think she's prime minister anymore, right?
Not anymore, no. But we did. Yeah, she made headlines for being quite progressive and being young and energetic. And then she started making headlines for all the wrong reasons during COVID. And then the world turned against her and now she's gone. So it's a bit of a shame because I was quite fond of her actually. But yeah, we were known for that, I think, for a while. But yeah. Happy to talk about my background a little bit if you want.
Yeah, have you, so you mentioned you had spent some time in Canada, but yeah, just give us a little more color and then we'll get into the meat.
Yeah, so I've been working in the marketing space, primarily digital marketing for the last 12, 13 years. I studied marketing and strategy at university. And my very first job I was doing at an agency, I was doing social media for Heineken beer, which was quite an interesting first job to have. But I was very quickly exposed to so many different elements of digital marketing right from the get-go, which was super helpful and interesting to me. And I'll talk about some of the lessons I've learned along the way shortly. But actually talking about that very first job with Heineken, I remember being the young, kind of fresh graduate coming into this agency, and they're like, "Hey, we need some social media ideas for Heineken, and here's the kind of framework of what they're doing." And I came up with what I thought was genuinely, quite fresh and interesting because, I was young and I had my thumb on the pulse of what was working in social media, and all these older people, they didn't really get it, right? And so I was like, yep, here's some good ideas. I'm pretty confident in them. Came up with these ideas. And I still remember my boss being like, yeah, those are good ideas, but those ideas won't resonate with the target market. They resonate with you, and you're not the target market. And that was a really powerful first message to learn from him, because I learned that at university, but putting into practice is always so different. We always seem to be biased to put forward what we think works, what we like, but then you always have to think what actually resonates with the target market. So anyway, just a quick anecdote on that. But after that, I mean, I dabbled in a bit of everything. I was in one of the very earliest certificates for Google Analytics. I did some super early lead scoring software through this old school CMS platform called Kentico. It was like one of the first lead scoring tools out there where you'd assign scores for visitors on websites, clicking on buttons and that kind of thing. All sorts. And then eventually, over the course of my career, I worked at different agencies. then on the client side, back to agency side, and then on my own as a consultant. And so along the path, I've touched kind of a bit of everything in the marketing space, but where I landed was kind of where my interests lie. And that is really on the branding and the web experience side of things. And the reason for that is because it's a really nice mix of strategic thinking and creative thinking and design and all of that coming together. And I kind of enjoyed the variation of that, as opposed to, say, working in analytics for a while. It was kind of a one-track mind, and I wasn't able to expand further out of that. But I think the main point being, I learned enough to be dangerous kind of in every little facet of digital marketing. And so it kind of has, over the years, generated kind of an interesting perspective on things, sometimes maybe a pessimistic or cynical perspective of some things as well, especially advertising, which I'll talk about. But yeah, so that's my rough background.
Love it. So you mentioned that you've worked with early stage companies in the past, maybe as they're starting to raise money. Maybe we could start with like one example of a company you work with that and what they ended up doing that worked well. And then we could talk maybe about like general frameworks and things.
Yeah. Well, I think they kind of go hand in hand, because what works well typically does, coincide with frameworks and that kind of thinking. And so, yeah, I can give you an example. So one client of ours is called Lift AI, and they developed an AI software for websites that essentially analyzes the behavior of website visitors using AI, and then detects whether they're likely to convert or not. So it assigns them a score. So it's kind of like lead scoring, but it uses different principles. It's instead of arbitrarily being like, oh, if someone clicks on that button, it must be worth 20 points. And if they go to the pricing page, it must be worth 5 points. This AI tool doesn't bother with any of that. It looks at every single micro behavioral action of that website visitor, uses machine learning to figure out, are they likely to convert or not? So that's what they built, this tool. And that was maybe 5 years ago. They've just built the AI tool, but they had actually nothing else. So they had no brand, no messaging, no website, no nothing. They just had this tool. And so this is where we came in and sort of helped them set up the foundation and move forward. So maybe I can kind of use that as an example to talk about and introduce some frameworks. But actually, maybe what might be helpful, Thomas, if you bring up, I've got a couple of slides here, just to sort of walk you through what I would do if I was doing that again, or if I was working with another early stage startup client. I've kind of called it the founder's playbook, because typically you are dealing with founders, but it might be, as you say, an entrepreneurial PM. But it's the same concept of how do you sort of pave the path for setting up growth, demand generation, and ultimately fundraising. And so what I want to talk about today is really, I'm trying to distill a whole world of marketing into a couple of concepts that are easy to follow. And so the way I look at it is this: it's positioning, proof, and promotion. So I'll walk through what this all means, but I guess I'd want to put forward the caveat that I'm assuming as part of this conversation that you already have a good product, or like you said, an MVP. My expertise isn't in building a winning product, although of course you pick up some things along the way. It's in promoting that product or distributing that product. So let's assume you've got a good product and use that as the foundation. And so, so what I would do if it was me, or if I was working with another startup company, is I would start by getting the positioning right. And that, I think, everything begins and ends with your positioning when it comes to marketing. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And I don't need the slide there for that, but essentially, if you've got a limited budget, right? So imagine if you're an early startup company, you don't have infinite funds, you haven't got fundraising yet. How do you go out and create demand? I think a lot of these companies go out and they spend money on advertising. It's the first thing they do is they go, we need to run some Google ads, or we need to run some ads on LinkedIn, or social media of some sort. And they go straight into what in marketing terms is actually advertising. And that's just one facet of marketing, right? And so I think a lot of people, first of all, conflate those two. They think they're one and the same thing when they're really not. Back in the day, there was this framework called the 4 Ps of marketing. This is going back 20, 30 years. I think it's 5 or 6 Ps now, but it was product, place, price, and promotion. And so most people go straight to promotion when they think of marketing, but forget the product, place, and price, and a number of other things now. So where I'm going with this is that, what you want to do first is you've got this great product, but you can't be everything to everyone. If you have a limited budget, you can't go out there and be like, well, this calendar tool that we've created or whatever your product is, it will go and help everyone with their day-to-day needs and tasks, because then you're competing with the big players like Google, and it's just too hard to enter a market that way. So you have to, first and foremost, position yourself against a niche audience. And that's what I think is at the very, very core of what an early stage company needs to be doing. And maybe they already know some of this because, probably as they build a product, they think about who's going to use this product and they think about maybe targeting a niche audience. Maybe they don't. But what I have found interesting is that sometimes people build products in that way, and then when it comes to marketing, suddenly they want it to be marketed to everyone. And it's like, well, hold on, didn't you build it to be for the specific audience? Well, then we need to market to that specific audience. So starting with a niche positioning. And so I can expand on what that means, but
yeah, I would just build on that and acknowledge that I wish in product development that we always started pretty narrow, but sadly, there is this siren of software, which is, well, why can't this serve everybody? Why can't this be a calendar for everyone? There's nothing technically that's holding us back from theoretically doing that. And invariably, what people learn is that, well, number one, there are general purpose tools often that are, in your space that exist. But then secondly, I think users and customers, they don't want a general purpose thing. They prefer something that's really optimized for them. So it's hard enough to narrow your product development. And I agree with you. It's very common, even if you do that right, you then go overboard on your marketing, and then you say, well, now I've built this thing, I want it to be available to everybody. And in fairness to some of the early founder marketers, those promotional tools, those advertising tools, they are designed to have you cast as wide a net as possible. I mean, we've all seen do you want to add these like 500 other keywords, or do you want to, opt into the expanded network option?
Exactly.
And, there's incentives for that for the advertising platform. Sometimes it's not always good for the founder.
Absolutely. And sometimes they even score you on your targeting and say, well, we think you should add this audience and this audience to build up your audience score. And, they make it sound like you're dumb for not doing what they recommend, but actually you're absolutely right. They just want the money. The other way that I see these, product developers start to lose their narrow focus is when they start thinking about fundraising and they're putting together their investor presentations and that kind of thing. And typically you go down the path of, what's our total addressable market? And you start getting all those figures. And then typically when you're doing that, most founders try and get the biggest number possible to try and impress or lure in the investors and say, well, look at this huge size of this market. And that's all very well and good, but that doesn't mean that you go and start marketing to that total addressable market, because there's just no way that it's like boiling an ocean. There's no way you'll do it. And so you have to have, in my opinion, a land and expand strategy where the landing is have this very narrow focus at the start, get some results and some traction there, and then start to expand outside of that. So, yeah. And so, the reason why I think this positioning is so important is, like I said, you could go and spend a bunch of money. Let's say you've got whatever, 50 grand to go and start scaling your demand generation. You can burn through that in advertising very, very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
And first of all, is advertising on its own like that is really hard to get right and to do a good job of. I mean, there are agencies and consultants that's all they do, and even then they might not get results. So first of all, it's hard. Second of all, let's say you're lucky enough to straight out of the gate develop a really powerful, compelling ad, and it works. And so people click on the ad and they go to your website or whatever the experience is. If that website or that experience doesn't match the quality of the ad or the positioning of the ad, then they're going to fall through the funnel anyway. And so what's the point in spending all that money on advertising if it leads to a dead end, essentially? And that's the other problem that I see quite often, is that if you happen to luck out and get the ads right, the experience on the other end of the ad isn't there to capture and convert those visitors. So that's why positioning is so important. Now, of course, positioning is easier said than done. And so there are some different ways you can go about it. The first thing I would say is, much like product development, it's not a set and forget exercise. It's something that is iterative and will absolutely change over time as you and the market change. So it's about getting it as good as you can for go to market, knowing that it's going to change. And I think one thing that trips up a lot of business owners at the positioning stage is they think, oh, well, if this is our positioning now, this is our positioning forever. And they get really tied up on, not getting it absolutely perfect right now. But the thing is, it has to be iterative, just like your product. And it's interesting with that client that I mentioned, Lift AI. I mean, we've repositioned them 3, 4, 5 times over the years, almost completely, as the market shifts, as we learn more. It's just like product development. So there's kind of an agile element to it.
How narrow did they go when they started?
Well, it was interesting. So I mentioned to you how their tool analyzes website visitor behavior.
Mm-hmm.
The narrow market that they selected to begin with was companies that use online chat. And so specifically, like Drift online chat, HubSpot chat, Intercom, that kind of thing. The data that Lift AI gives you is applicable to any tool. It could be pop-ups, it could be CRMs, it could be content personalization. It integrates with everything, but they picked conversational marketing to be their narrow focus first. And it's truly only because they knew that space well already, and from a previous job. And so they picked what they knew, and they ran with that, and it worked because it's because then they could tailor all of their messaging to here's how we supercharge your conversational marketing, rather than here's how we make your whole website better and everything that you do. We had that narrow focus to begin with, and so it landed better because, again, you can't be everything to everyone.
Kudos to them for being so focused early. That is a really clear audience to hit. And I would imagine if I had just spent all this money implementing, some chatbot stuff or some conversational stuff, and then I landed on the Lyft landing page that said, oh, we're made for people that have these, implemented these capabilities. Now you can get the most out of it. I would much prefer that versus the general purpose, like we improve your conversion rates no matter who you are.
Exactly. Granted, now over time, today, 5 years later, they are going to the market with we can improve everything, but they've got the credibility and the foundation set to do that now. But certainly from the start, there's no way it would have landed doing that. And so I think that's my key piece of advice when it comes to positioning is find your niche audience. And when it comes to creating that positioning, there are different ways of going about it. What we do is we start with something called, the brand foundation. And at its core, a brand foundation consists of 2 things: a verbal identity and a visual identity. So a verbal identity is articulating who you are, like as a company, and how you show up in the world, and who your target audience is. So there's a number of different elements that are part of that verbal identity. But at its core, it's essentially, what do we do that's unique, that we are strong at, that a niche audience cares about a lot. That's what it comes down to, positioning. Now, that's easier said than done. It's not like you can just go into a meeting with your team and be like, hey, you guys, we need to do this positioning. Let's get it sorted. It's pretty hard to get it right. And so what I can recommend is, obviously you can work with an agency or a consultant to create something like a verbal identity. But if you're doing it yourself, I would look at strategizer.com, have a bunch of great resources. They have a value proposition canvas, which is one tool you can use to connect your products' value propositions to the wants and needs of your target audience. So that's a great place to start. And then another resource I'd recommend is there's someone called April Dunford, who has done a lot of great work around positioning. And she has some free resources on her website about how to do positioning. And I've used some of her stuff before. It's really, really great. So, in terms of DIY, doing it yourself, start there. That would be my advice.
Rory, let me ask you a quick follow-up on how do you pick where to land? Let's just assume that everybody's listening is like, yes, land and expand, start narrow. Sometimes you build something and you're like, oh, well, this could be useful to a marketer that just implemented a chatbot, but it could also be interesting to a marketer who, is selling, professional services. Like there's a variety of areas to land on a beach.
Yep. Yep.
How do you recommend people pick?
Great question. So there are different ways of approaching it. The right way to approach it would be doing competitive analysis and finding out where there are gaps, and so where does your product solve or provide the most value in terms of, let's say there are 12 different narrow lanes you could pick. Find the lane or the focus that where your product provides the most value. That's also quite tricky. It sounds good to say that out loud, but it's like, it's easier said than done to figure that out. So you really have to talk to the different audiences, you know, like you might have to use your network here or friends, family. See if you can talk to someone from each of these different audience groups and sort of test it as a soundboard. It's not going to be statistically significant data to get back, but just to get a sounding board on, like, would this really help and provide value to you? Does this solve your problems? That kind of thing. Talk to your customers and potential customers to try and find out where the extra value might be hiding. That's one place to start. Another place would be just pick whatever audience you know best. If in short of any competitive analysis and doing what I just said and talking to customers, pick the lane that you're most comfortable with, because at least then you don't have to go through the process of learning everything you need to learn about that audience and their field. You already have a bit of a foundation to start with. And then the essence of moving quickly, I'd start there.
Yeah. I liked your Lyft example because sounded like the founders knew that audience well. And I've worked with some founders where they've said, oh, I could go into this market, but I think the TAM is too small there. And what I try and invite them to consider is, okay, yes, for that beachhead, the TAM is not gigantic, but let's acknowledge we all think that the end game is to expand to the entire beach anyway. So if you think that this currently small TAM area is where you can get your first 100 users that are paying you, like that's probably way better than trying to go after this other area, which might have a much bigger TAM, but you're not even going to get to your first 10 users because you don't know them, or to your point, Rory, they have other alternatives that are, where the gap isn't as big. So, getting those first few points on the board, even if it's in a smaller area, can sometimes be way more beneficial in the long run.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. But the trouble with that is that I've found time and time again that many founders don't want to limit the value of their product, as you naturally wouldn't want to, right? You don't want to spend, blood, sweat, and tears and money and years building a product and then saying, well, I know this product could apply to all these different people, but you're saying that I have to focus just on this little bit. Well, what if this other audience over here sees our messaging and doesn't want it because it's so tailored to this audience over here? We're going to miss out. And the answer is, yeah, true. But if you open up your messaging and your value prop too wide, you're not going to get anyone. So you may as well start with someone, narrow. It's quite hard and it's difficult to do, but it's absolutely the right advice, I think, for a startup company. Now, when you get some fundraising potentially and you're ready to start scaling up, then maybe you're in a different position to cast the net a bit wider. But absolutely, you got to start small for sure.
Yeah, that reminds me, after you get your first capital from the outside in, I know from experience that it's very easy to kind of feel like you're playing with house money on your marketing budget. And, you're like, oh, well, let's increase the budget on, the search ad campaign and the social campaign and the whatever LinkedIn ad campaign. And, a blink of an eye, you're blowing through tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes in a few days.
Yeah, it can happen.
Yeah. So be careful, like try and keep that pre-funding frugality. But of course, at some point you're going to have to invest in growth, and if it's done well and judiciously, it can be a real big deal.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there are a few other steps I would take before I start spending that money on the advertising. So I talked about articulating your brand and a verbal identity, connecting it to a target audience. So let's say you figured out what your value propositions are and who your niche audience is, and you know that pretty well as you can for now. Now what, right? So the second side of the coin to setting a brand foundation, I've talked about the verbal side, is the visual side. So most people, when they think of a brand, they think of the logo. Its visual identity is really much more than that. You know, and you know, at a high level, it's the logo is an outcome of the visual identity, which is colors, fonts, styles, layouts, white space, you know, all that stuff comes together. And so the point I'd like to make is that a visual identity should reflect the verbal identity. And so it should resonate with your target audience, and it should not necessarily resonate with yourself, because that's the other trap that people fall into. They're like, oh, I would like to create a brand that looks really good. And they don't realize that they're biasing it based on what they think looks good. But it doesn't actually matter if you like it or not. I mean, ideally, as a founder or a product owner, you'd like your own brand, right? But it needs to resonate with your target audience. And so that's the thing that matters the most. And so that kind of connects the dots visually to what you're saying verbally. And so obviously there's a process you can go through to get those visuals done. But this is where I'd all start. Like I'll start with articulating it, the conceptually, verbally first, then visualize the brand. And now it's time to put that brand to work. And so typically what you would do after you have, you know, set the brand foundations, like I mentioned, is, okay, you think you're ready to maybe spend some advertising dollars and start generating demand. Well, not quite, because like I said at the start of this call, if you generate demand and they land on the wrong experience, then it's not going to convert, it's not going to work. So that's where, you know, having a website comes into play, and a good website. And so I think that is critical to the brand foundation, because, I mean, let's face it, the website is the modern store. I mean, that is the primary conversion point of your customers going forward. And so it needs to be done right. And there's a tried and true process for creating a good website. And I'm not going to go into the details of that because it'll get kind of boring. But if anyone's interested, they're happy to reach out. But what I will say is that a good website needs to be easy for you to update as a founder, as a team. So it should be built on a no-code platform. You certainly don't want to be relying on a developer to make changes and tweaks to the website, because you will be changing quickly. So that needs to be, you know, first and foremost is picking the right platform. But then ultimately, you need to have a mix of conversion-oriented copywriting. So the copywriting on the website needs to express what you've already articulated in the verbal identity. So that's where that positioning comes back into play, right? And so this is where the first thing you see on a website is the homepage, the header section, right? So the very first thing you see. This is where you'd put, you know, your niche audience up there. And this one of the hardest things I've dealt with in my website projects is the very first headline that you see. I always tailor it to that audience. And that's where I get the pushback saying, oh, well, that's too limiting. What if someone else comes to the website? It won't apply to them. And I have the same battle every time, because I get it. I get that you don't want to limit yourself, but you have to. And so anyways, there's a bunch of tactics and tools for creating what's called kind of conversion-oriented copywriting. But that's essential across the whole website. And then, of course, you know, it needs to have a place to capture prospect data. So this is where you might bring in a tool like, say, HubSpot. HubSpot have a free version that you can use where you can embed a HubSpot form. Anyone that fills out the form gets placed into your HubSpot database, and now you've got a database of customers to potentially, you know, market to going forward. So that's essential. It needs to be responsive, as in it needs to work well on desktop, mobile, tablet. That's a given. And then, you know, ultimately the user experience has to be good, at least. And so, and this, you know, you can talk for hours about user experience, but ultimately you want to make sure that the website is easy to use. The rule of thumb is, you know, could you use it if you're drunk? And if you can, then the UX is fine. But product developers probably know a lot about that already if they're developing software. So again, I won't go into the details of what makes a good website, but you need to have that website at least express and convey what we've just set the foundations on. The visual and the verbal identity need to be expressed and conveyed in a compelling way. That's the goal of a website.
Rory, tell me about which no-code website platforms you've some of them that you feel like have been pretty good for lean teams, but kind of, you know, present all the flexibility and look great for prospective customers.
Yeah, there's a bunch of tools out there. The one that I favor is called Webflow. They were a company that was started in Europe, maybe 2013, can't remember the exact date, but essentially their goal was, we hate WordPress. We want to create a tool that deals with all of the problems of WordPress. And that was their whole shtick, was that. And they succeeded. I mean, they had ridiculous growth in Europe, and then maybe in the last 5 years, they started getting more growth in North America. So I've been using Webflow primarily for my clients, but you can get away with, Wix and Squarespace, if you're on a limited time and budget. That's something you could even potentially do yourself. You won't get the same, level of quality, but those are good no-code platforms for sure. So Wix, Webflow, and Squarespace.
Great. Thanks for the reco. So
No
now
worries.
let's make believe you have your beachhead identified, you have your verbal identity, your visual identity, you've got your Webflow or similar website that's kind of aligned with that and ready to go. Maybe it's got a HubSpot form. Then what?
Cool. Good question. So only now do I think you're ready to start generating demand. So I think those steps that I've just walked through are prerequisites to generating demand, because otherwise any advertising dollar you spend either won't resonate, and if it does happen to resonate, it's going to land on the wrong experience. So you've got that sorted. Now what I would do, if I was on a limited budget, so let's say we don't have tens of thousands of dollars at our disposal to start advertising, here's what I would do. I would start generating proof that your product works and upload that to the website. And so what that means is, it depends on what your product is, if you're B2B or B2C or whatever. Let's assume B2B for now. What I would do is I would get at least 3 case studies of how your product is solving the exact problems that you articulated in your verbal identity with ideally your target market. And so this, this is all easy to say out loud, much harder to do in person, but give your product away to 3 potential customers, and give them the white glove treatment. So, hold their hand, talk to them every day, do as much as you possibly can to make your product demonstrate the value that you're trying to market. The whole point is to get some metrics or some testimonial or quote from that client or customer to prove that your product works, because I think that's becoming more and more essential to the fundraising side of things, because there was a time where you could probably get fundraising if you just mentioned the term AI in your product. And before that, it was probably blockchain. There was little windows of hype where if you were building a product in that space, it was much easier to get fundraising. I think those ships have both sailed already. Even the AI one is on the way out. And so I think, and you'd know better than me, Tom, but I think investors are now being more cautious. And it's all very well and good doing the financials and doing the investor presentations where here's our TAM and here's our projected financials and all that good stuff. But I still think you need proof that this thing actually works, not just for the investor crowd, but for potential customers. And so when a customer comes to your website, it's all very well and good having this great positioning, but do we know that it actually has worked for someone like me before? And so it's a really important trust indicator. But the interesting thing I would do here, because it sounds kind of obvious to be like, okay, yeah, get some proof, get some testimonials or whatever. What I would do when it comes to generating proof that your product works is, if at all possible, try and fabricate a success story where your product works really well alongside another product. It might be that there's no actual integration between them. It just so happens that you'd be like, hey, our calendar tool works really, really well with this other tool over here. And here's an example of how our customer did this. And the reason why I say that is because it gives you some ammo to go to that company, the partner company. So we'll just pick a random, another random company to go with our calendar tool. Could be a CRM of some description. Let's just call it HubSpot. It's probably a bit too big of a fish to fry, but we'll just use that as an example. You get this really great case study with your client of how your product's working really well, but specifically how it's working really well alongside HubSpot. Then you can take that to HubSpot and be like, hey, you guys might be interested in this, by the way. We've wrote this case study. We've got this video testimonial of this client saying how great HubSpot is with our product. Feel free to share. And if they happen to share, whether it's a LinkedIn post or an email or whatever, share to their network your case study because it makes them look good, their product look good, then suddenly you're hitching a ride with a much more established, bigger brand than yours. And so it's free advertising, first of all, and it's a much bigger trust indicator than some startup company that not many people have heard of. So that would be my main focus, is how can you make your product look good alongside another product, even if there's no actual integration between them? Because the whole point is you want to hitch a ride with another company that's got a bigger network than you, because otherwise the only other option is to spend tens of thousands of dollars of advertising, right? So
Rory, let's say that someone out there's listening and they're thinking, yes, I agree with you. If I had these testimonials, they would increase my conversion rates, but that most early stage customers are a little bit leery of trying the product at all, and then getting them to approve being mentioned or seen endorsing my product is a tall ask. Or they might ask for a major discount or the right to use the product for free for some period of time. How much is it worth it? Like if you had two equivalent websites, but one had the testimonials, or just one good testimonial, and the other one had a list of cool features and video demo, but no testimonial. Like, how big of a difference do you think that makes?
Good question. First of all, I think it makes a critical difference because one has trust indicators, the other has no trust indicators. So the other one, you're taking a much bigger risk if you don't see that it's worked for people like you before. But actually, the strategy is less about that. I think it is important to have those trust indicators on your website. But I think where I'm going with this is that ideally, so to answer your question, like, do they expect a discount, that kind of thing, you give it away for completely free, this product, to 3 key customers that you think can really demonstrate the value of your product. Give it away for free, give them the white glove treatment, and make sure the product works well for them and they actually generate value of some description, right? Then what you do is, and Lift AI and the founder there is really good at this, is you make the customer the hero of the story. And so you make them look really smart. Look how smart Tom was. He used this calendar to save 3 hours a day because he did this, and this. For his company. So make them look really good, because then they're more likely to share the case study. And when I say case study, it's more than just a testimonial. It's like it's a video and a big story. Here are the challenges. Here's what they did to solve it. Blah blah blah. It's like a big full-on landing page with the content. Then the customer themselves, first of all, are more likely to share that story in their own network, which is free advertising. But like I said, if you can make it look good alongside another product, then hopefully they will share the case study. And that's where most of the value is in that strategy, because it's they're sharing it to their network that already is established and already has potentially thousands of followers or whatever the social channel is. Much better to get that than to try and spend advertising money promoting your own message. Rather have another established company share your message for you. That's the core of that strategy. And so I will add the caveat that it's much easier said than done to get that right? It's very difficult, first of all, to get a case study. Second of all, to make it work alongside another product and get them to approve it. But if you can make that work, because I've seen it work in the past, it's worked for Lift AI. It's a great way to bootstrap some demand generation without spending advertising dollars. And along the way, you make the customer look smart too.
Yeah, I think the key thing there for people to remember is that I think we all acknowledge that doing that would require a ton of work and time.
Yep.
I think what we're saying is, look, you might actually spend half as much to generate on your marketing, on your advertising, to generate the same results with this kind of increased conversion rate and increased trust from prospective users. So yeah, it is. You kind of have to take 2 steps back to take 3 steps forward. And because a lot of founders are like, man, I could spend time building, the 11th feature, or maybe landing a few more customers through founder-led sales. So this is one where you have to make a strategic call, which is like, wow, we really are gonna, because you're not just saying throw a couple logos up. It's a real case study and a description and a video and the ROI and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I absolutely would invest the time into that. Of course, you have to make a call. There are so many dependents and variables. I mean, there might be other things happening in your business that you need to spend time on, but absolutely, because the other benefit of going through that process of spending time with your customers and making sure that the product's working for them is that you end up learning a lot about your customers, and that helps you refine your positioning and what works and what doesn't, and you can pull that through into all your other marketing as well. So it's a win-win-win, and the only losers, and potentially no advertising dollars spent either. The loser is just time, but I think it's not necessarily a loss because, like I said, you learn so much along the way as well. So I think it's well worth doing, but it only applies, if you have a B2C product, then that's less of a thing. You don't really have case studies, and so that's trickier to get right. And that's when you start getting into, well, maybe you'd pay an influencer on social media to do a post about your product working well in their personal lives, and that starts to get expensive and pretty tricky. So yeah, that's the proof side of things is you've got positioning, and then you've got proof that your product works. And then the last step is now promote. So, I talked a lot about how people start with promotion. Promotion comes after you've got the positioning down packed and you've got some proof in the market that your product's doing what it says it does on the tin. Now it's time to, get some demand, but you might be running out of funds. And so this is where you have to be smart about how you use the remaining dollars that you have at your disposal. And that's, again, why I said focus really hard on trying to hitch a ride on a partner product on their social networks to get them to share. But on top of that, I would also do, as in terms of a foundational thing to generate traffic over time, is an SEO strategy. I think, an SEO is kind of often glossed over because it's like, every website's got SEO, but there's a way to do it right, and there's a way that actually works. So just a quick spiel on SEO. There's two sides of the coin. One is there's a technical element of SEO where you need to make sure your website is optimized from a back-end technical perspective to be set up for SEO results. So that's one side of things. That's typically baked into the web design process. The other side of the coin is generating ongoing useful content for your website that eventually builds traffic over time. And so some people conflate this with, oh, you mean doing a blog, which is essentially correct. But there's a strategy to it. And actually, everything I've talked about today, there are deep rabbit holes in each individual thing I've talked about where, you could be an expert in just that one thing. But SEO, for example, we've learned that the process typically is you want to do what's called a keyword analysis first, which is where you analyze what words are people actually using on Google or the like to find products like yours. So that way you can ensure you're using the right words in these blog articles. And then you want to do a competitive analysis to find out what keywords are your competitors trying to target and where are the gaps that we can maybe try and fill. Then you want to start creating what's called a content calendar, where you map out a bunch of different articles based on these keywords that you found that people are searching for. And what you do is you find what's called a benchmark article for each one of those items you've got in the calendar, where you say, what is the #1 top ranking article that shows up for this keyword currently, and how do we beat it? So that's the goal. And there's then there's the actual writing of the blog post itself, which is its own thing. What I can tell you is that we ran a test with one of our clients where they were writing their own blog article for the purposes of SEO versus us going through our process to write it. And I think it was something like we got 5 times as more traffic from our posts and 4 times the conversions or something of that nature compared to theirs, just because we followed this process where, it's a strategy first. And so the reason why I bring this all up is that it's all very well and good to be like, yep, our website's got SEO set up in the back end and that's all good. We'll generate traffic over time. It's like, no, it's actually its own, whole world that you could be investing in. But the point is, if you get it right, it eventually, if you put in the upfront, keyword analysis, competitor analysis, and then create, say, a 12-month content calendar, then the actual cost of writing that content each month and publishing it is pretty low. And so over time, when you generate those SEO results, you can kind of see it. People call it free traffic. It's not quite free, but it ends up, potentially outperforming ads because it's just people finding you naturally through Google. So really important that you get that right too. And I also think that doubles back in the proof side of things, because you can prove to investors and customers that you are experts in your space because you are creating content that people are resonating with, and that you can be trusted because you are experts in your field that you built your product in. So there are a whole number of reasons to do SEO right. But again, it's one of those things that you need to take seriously and give credence to, because it's easier said than done.
Yeah, and that's another area where you don't get instant gratification. It is the
Mm-mm.
opposite of dropping a few grand on your favorite social media platform and doing a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
sponsored posts, right? Like it
Absolutely. Yep.
yeah, with those you get to see the data right away and you're like, "Oh wow, I'm bringing more traffic to the site." But it's kind of like there's a little bit of a sugar rush with it and you have to keep pouring money into it.
And it's
Whereas
and it's temporary. Yeah. The
yeah,
other problem is that those ads, you'll run out of budget, and then once the
yeah,
budget's run out, the tap's turned off, right?
yeah,
Fully turned off. Nothing
yeah.
else is coming through. So if you haven't got the results you were hoping to get from that paid advertising, then you're at a dead end. Whereas SEO, at least you know that, hey, I'm not getting instant gratification, but if I do this right over time, I'll start building a steady audience. And so you're totally right. It's kind of not an exciting and sexy topic for people to pay for, because they're like, you tell them, hey, look, this is a long-term play, but it's worth it. The return on investment is there. You just have to wait the time. So yeah, so SEO, case studies, both those things I would do. And then, only then, if you've got some budget remaining, then maybe I would start turning to paid advertising. So after all those other things I talked about, then I'd get to the thing that most people start with, which is, then you might run the Google ads, then you might run the paid LinkedIn ads, depending on where your target audience is, of course. You don't just pick your favorite tool, you pick the tool that your target audience is most likely going to be in. And then that's where you start generating content. But that, again, is another whole rabbit hole, because it's not easy just to create an ad that converts. It's really, really hard. There's so much noise out there. You have to have something that's creative and interesting and bold and stops you in your tracks and is compelling. And that's really hard to do. It's not simple. And so even advertising is not a tried and true bet, because you could get it wrong and it might just generate nothing. In fact, more often than not, I'd say it probably doesn't work, because it is hard to get right. So that's the last piece I would look at. And I sort of mentioned, if you had 50K, you'd be at the end of that by now for sure. But at least if you have the foundation set up, so the positioning is down packed and the visual side of it is done, and the website experience is good, and you've got some proof, at least now you can show all of that to investors and you have that much more credibility, rather than, hey, we ran 40 grand worth of ads and look, we generated 3,000 clicks to the website and got 3 sales. Now what? I just, yeah.
Yeah, I think some of those fundamentals that you talked about are, they're kind of like these annuities that keep paying off after you've made the initial investment. And they're less volatile depending on your marketing budget. And then what you could do when things are going really well is you can put some paid advertising to accelerate and to kind of turn up the volume, but you really want the fundamentals nailed first. It's like insulating your home before you turn up the thermostat, in the winter or
Exactly.
something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's so interesting, having now been in the space for, like I said, 12, 13 years. I've gone through this process so many times with business owners, founders, or heads of marketing, that kind of thing, where I've seen time and time again, they always gravitate to, well, let's get some paid advertising done, because of that instant gratification. But another thing I should mention is not just that, but often it's pressure from colleagues or angel investors, or or silent partners, and they're like, hey, we're not seeing anything, we want to, we got to get some traction here. And so they end up spending those dollars because of that, and it ends up falling through the cracks, and the funnel is leaking because they haven't got those foundations in place. So yeah, it's absolutely right, is that it's hard to spend money on, but it pays its dividends more and more.
Yeah, I mean, paid advertising, it's a double-edged sword as well, because sometimes it can mask lack of product market fit, where you want to show month over month growth and you can kind of put your foot on the gas for the pay advertising, but it's a little bit artificial, right? And so yeah, I don't want to hate on paid advertising. I think you need it to get to orders of magnitude of scale when you're ready for it.
Yeah,
But if
exactly.
you do it too early, it can kind of mask bigger issues. So, Rory, it's been fantastic having you on the program. How can
Thanks for having
people,
me.
yeah, how can people learn more about you and GoDemandGen and maybe, get more help if they're ready for it.
Yeah, if they're interested, we've actually just created a little landing page just for this conversation. So go demandgen.com/Tom. It just shows you some of the elements that I've talked about, and we're happy to help you with any of those elements individually or as a bundle. And of course, if you do it as a bundle, there'll be quite heavy discounts. But it might be that, for example, a lot of times our clients work with us in that way, where we start with just a brand foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we go through a process of discovery and then creating the verbal identity and visual identity. And that project on its own is typically enough for the client to then trust us. Like, okay, you get it. We're happy with what you've done so far. Let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle. So, my advice would be start there. But yeah, so if you're interested, feel free to check out that page and just contact us, and we'll be in touch.
Love it. Well, thank you for sharing all this great advice, Rory. It resonated with me. I think it aligns with what I've seen over the years as well. And this is kind of advice that I think a lot of people intellectually, like, they get that it's the right thing, but it's kind of like a little bit of, hey, eat healthy and exercise. You have to work.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It is like that. Yeah. I've noticed that too, because it's none of it is a surprise, really. When you hear the whole, you should have a niche audience, and you use the analogy of the beachhead, everyone nods along and like, yeah, that sounds right. And then when it comes time to practice, it doesn't seem to happen. It's quite weird, but it must be what you kind of, as you say, it's like eating healthy, doing exercise, all that kind of thing.
I think we're all human, and if someone's like, oh, take this pill and you'll live forever, it's very tempting. Versus like, oh, I have to get healthy sleep and healthy diet and exercise. Like, that does require work. But the people that do the latter generally, live a long time.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Absolutely. Yeah. No, but thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And it's been an interesting conversation, and you asked really great questions. So I appreciate it.
I love it, Rory. Well, I'll let you go, but thank you again for joining us. And folks should go check out GoDemandGen.com/Tom, and you can learn more about the founder package. And, if you're not a founder and you're working at a company that's further along, I'm sure you guys work with all kinds of companies.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yep. All sizes and shapes.
Cool. Thanks, Rory.
Thank you. Cheers.
Take care, buddy.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. That was Rory a lot of great advice there for some of you entrepreneurial PMs who are maybe a little bit past MVP, or you finally got your MVP showing some viability. Be careful about having that burning hole in your pocket and going to LinkedIn ads or even Google search ads or Instagram ads or whatever. There will be a time for that. But to repeat Rory's point, make sure you have a really clear audience in mind. Make sure you have a very clear language identity for why your product exists and for who and why the world needs it. And then have the visual identity and have the proof points. And then work on the organic stuff. And then if you really want to start, putting gas on it, go for it. But try and do it in that order of operations. Last thing I'll share is, if you guys found this conversation interesting and you're like, wow, I stumbled upon this stream and I would like to see more of these kinds of conversations. A couple things you can do. Of course, you can follow me on LinkedIn, subscribe to Fireside PM on YouTube. I also have a Substack, it's a free one, and I summarize all of my previous interviews. So like this one is with Dan from Limitless. And you'll see you've got the video, but then also like some of the key takeaways that he and I covered in our hour-long conversation. So go ahead and check that out on firesidepm.substack.com. And then if you are a product lead or founder and you want some consulting or one-on-one coaching, you can hit me up at tomleungcoaching.com. But hopefully this was useful to you. Let me know in the comments if there's other topics you want to hit. Someone asked me today, hey, can you do an episode about how PMs who are in the job market who don't have AI experience but see a million jobs asking for it, like what can they do? So I'm thinking of having a guest who I have to see if they've accepted my invitation. But there's a few people that I think would be amazing to talk about that. So let me know if that would be of interest to you. And if there's other topics you want me to hit in future episodes, I'm all ears. But with that, we're going to get back to work. Bye, team.